All right, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to everybody from Seattle, Washington. I'm from the other Washington. You're at the real Washington. Typically, this is the type of season that I get to travel around the country, but I wish I was with you. So I'm Liz Schreier. I am the President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and I want to begin with my deepest thoughts and prayers for all those that either yourself or your family are suffering or had lost from COVID-19. And I wish you all well. I wish your families well and hope you are healthy. I am so pleased that you have taken the time to join us for a really important discussion, a virtual town hall meeting to talk about in the midst of COVID-19, how America's role in the world matters and what we should be doing and how it connects to what we do at home, and how lucky we are to have a virtual town hall with a true friend and champion of the USGLC, and that's, of course, your Congressman Adam Smith, who represents Washington 19. You will see him, and I'm going to introduce him to all of you in a moment, but I do want to acknowledge him because he is in our Zoom room, and I'm so thrilled that he could join us today. First, a few logistics. It is not obviously a typical town hall, so you are all on mute so that we can keep the background noise out and so you can hear our speaker. But we are going to bring you in when we get to the question and answer period of time. There's a few ways that you can do it. Some of you submitted questions beforehand. There's also down at the bottom of your screen, if you're on by computer, top if you're on by iPad, to actually push participant, and there's a raise your hand model. Probably a lot of you are getting used to this already. If you're calling in by phone, you'll be able, when we get to that, *9 to raise your hand, and I'll call on you. You *6 to unmute yourself. And there's also a Q&A function down at the bottom, and you can write your question. Let me give you just a little bit of context to set the scene for our conversation today. USGLC, the organization who's the host today, is celebrating its 25th anniversary. 25th anniversary, the world was quite different when we began, but we began out of another period of time, which was right after the Cold War had ended, and some of our fellow citizens thought we won. We could actually have a peace dividend and pull back from the world. So put that in the context of today. Pulling back from the world to some meant we didn't need things like the State Department, USAID, our Peace Corps. And many of us, myself included, thought that would be quite dangerous for us to pull back in the world. So we started to organize. And what came out of that is your host for today's conversation, the USGLC. And we are a big tent organization. Some actually call us the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. You are being hosted by a group of 500 organizations and NGOs, everything from companies like Walmart and Coca-Cola and Google and Boeing, NGOs like World Vision and CARE and Save the Children. And we are very proud that we're bipartisan. Our National Advisory Council is chaired by General Colin Powell, and is every former living Secretary of State and former Secretaries of Defense on our advisory committee. And we're proud that over 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals make up our National Security Advisory Council. And we live in every state, and so proud, including so many of you from Washington State, that help support and think about our activity. Because what brings us all together is what we're going to talk about today, that America needs to be engaged and lead in the world, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, because it matters for our security, for our economic interests, and for our values. And what better example could there be, frankly, than here we are in the midst of a pandemic, because what matters and happens overseas truly matters to us here in our local communities. So what do we do at USGLC? We have forums like what we're going to do today, and we are talking about COVID-19 like we will today, because a disease anywhere is a disease everywhere. We are seeing that a disease has no borders, that it can travel in just 36 hours. So we advocate to make sure America engages in that, and it's specifically around a part of the federal budget called the international affairs budget. It's about 1% of the federal budget. A lot of people call it the foreign aid budget, but it's way more than that. It is our diplomats who work overseas around the world. It is actually our healthcare workers who are helping other countries to stop the pandemic that we're seeing. It's programs that help open our markets for our goods and services. So fortunately, we're going to have a conversation around that, and to lead and help our conversation is one of the premier experts in Congress. So I'm going to introduce our premier expert and bring him in, and we're going to have an incredible conversation. Now, he's no stranger to all of you because he represents most of you, and that, of course, is the congressman who represents Washington 9, who has been on the front line of Washington State's effort to stop COVID-19, given you were at the front line in one of the first states who had to deal with it. But to USGLC, he has been a true champion of the issues we're going to talk about. And as you can see, our title of what we're all about is building a better, safer world. And Adam Smith has been doing that his entire career. He is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, traveled the world. Everywhere he goes, I know he learns about the world and brings that back, because then he leads and creates legislation to make the world a better place. He's the co-founder and now co-chair of a caucus called the Effective Foreign Assistance Caucus, to make sure we're not just using our foreign assistance, but we're using it effectively. And I can tell you that when he speaks around national security or foreign policy in Washington, his colleagues from both sides of the aisle listens. So Congressman, welcome to our stage, and we look forward to learning from you and learning with you. Everybody welcome Congressman Adam Smith. And now they all get to see you. How's your family and how are you?
I am doing just fine, and so is my family. Changes for all of us, challenging times, but for the moment, I'm lucky in that regard.
Terrific, terrific. Well, I want to start off the conversation. I got lots to ask you, and I know your constituents have lots to ask you. So we're clearly going to talk about COVID-19 and America's role in responding to it. And if I can, I'm going to start with a 30-second video that everybody has now seen. I sure wish we had seen it a few years ago. You're going to recognize who this is, and I'm going to ask you a question on the back end.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
So, Congressman, that is your neighbor, Bill Gates, who gave that TED Talk in 2015. And we didn't listen, of course. We didn't have the political will. But you've been singing off that same song sheet as well. You have been talking about the fact that 70% of the world doesn't have the ability to prevent, detect, or respond to a global pandemic. So without placing blame on any one person or one party, which I know you've talked about this, tell us kind of how we got here, how we never have the will to invest in prevention, and then we'll get into what we do about it. But just kind of how we got to this place.
Well, there's two pieces to this. I mean, and the one is something you've been working on broadly at U.S. Global Leadership, but I really appreciate the leadership that you've shown in pulling together the issues as you described in the intro. I think it's crucially important. How do we work together as a globe to meet global challenges? And after World War II, we put in place a very complex system to attempt to do that. Complicated, obviously, by the fact that a good chunk of the world wasn't part of it in the Soviet bloc and China. But we still relied on international institutions, and that was a central premise that came out of the post-World War II world. We kind of gone mostly on our own for a long period of time, and ultimately it led to a war that killed over 60 million people. And that finally got everyone's attention and said, maybe there's a better way to do this. And one of the keys is not to have like a dominant power necessarily, but to have global institutions. And we built a large number of them. Obviously the United Nations is one of the more visible, but we also built things like NATO and CETO and the OAA, but the principle was let's work together, but also crucially, it wasn't just, you'd had defense pacts in the past. If you get attacked, we'll militarily try to protect each other. This looked at broader issues, created the World Bank and the IMF. Eventually we had the WHO. We looked at it and said, if there's a problem, how can we bring the globe together to work on it? And that was a fundamental premise of how we approached it. Now, having said that it was global, the other fundamental piece of this was that the U.S. was going to lead. And basically after World War II, there was an almost unprecedented moment in history when much of the world basically felt like the U.S. being engaged was a positive thing by definition. I was always struck by, I read Thomas Friedman's From Beirut to Jerusalem, small little story, but when the U.S. decided in 1983 that we were going to send troops to Lebanon to try and help, control the civil war there, optimism in Lebanon went up dramatically just from that decision, because the notion was if the U.S. is there, things are going to get better. And obviously, as you can tell, it didn't exactly work out in Lebanon, and considerable skepticism has grown over that principle. But that was the basic idea. The U.S. was going to be sort of the key indispensable nation, but we were going to do it globally. That basic concept has been eroding for some time. In some cases, and the way I viewed how we transition here was kind of a positive. Part of the reason it was eroding is because other countries rose up. At the end of World War II, Europe was a wasteland. China was a backwater. There wasn't anyone else. Well, eventually Europe grew up, Japan developed, Taiwan, South Korea, China. You had a lot more global players. We were not as dominant. And to my mind, I view that as a positive, because now you've got more assets at your disposal. We could work with China. We could work with Russia once the wall fell. And you had more players on the scene to try to confront terrorism, nuclear war, pandemics. But rivalries developed out of that, and skipping the long tortured history of how that played out, it started to create problems, and that started to undermine those global institutions. At the same time, domestically in the US, our dominance waned, and it began to have some really severe economic repercussions for people who had to suddenly compete with the rest of the world. Again, there's a long explanation of that. So there was growing skepticism. We started talking, we stopped paying the UN. And this all sort of came to a head in America First, in the notion that what are we doing messing around with the rest of the world? We got our own problems, let's get away. And all of that made it more difficult to confront a pandemic like this and to prepare for it. I firmly believe that. US leadership, a commitment to global institutions definitely waned. Now, the second thing that's worth talking about is it's hard to prepare for things that are unimaginable. And, I think a big part of the reason why our leadership when this waned in the last decade was because, if you remember, we had the bird flu, we had SARS, we had MERS, we had H1N1. And I remember, I've been in Congress for a long time, and I was in Congress back then, emergency preparedness people coming up to me and saying, it's going to be chaotic. You've got to do something. We got to do this. And I was like, okay, great. Yeah. And then we looked around going, well, okay. Didn't really pan out. And I think that contributed a lot to this. The notion that we've heard this before. And I'll tell you, just my own perspective, I heard about it. I saw the intel briefs going back to January. I sort of, saw the threat, but still I had those other instances in my mind. It was not until
February. The sky didn't fall, right?
Exactly.
The sky didn't fall, so right.
It wasn't until February 27th when I flew out with the entire Washington delegation and the head of the CDC and the head of CMS to meet Vice President Pence and some other leaders and tour Washington State as the disease was spreading in our state. When I really talked to them, when I was like, forgive me, well, shit. this is going to be an enormous problem.
This is real. This one's
Yeah.
real. Yeah.
And a lot of other people were slower to get there even than I was. And I won't go off on a long Trump administration jag here, but they have been very slow to respond. And because of their rejection of these international institutions and everything, the response has not been just slow. It has also been incompetent. And these are all things that we desperately need to work on.
All right, so let's get to what we do. And I'm going to now actually poll our wonderful crowd in the town hall, because we can't be that interactive, but we're going to try to be a little bit. So one of the things that we did is we wanted to see where the American public were about understanding this interconnection between the world. So there's actually a poll function to all our participants in this town hall. And I want to see how well you can guess how American public is. So here's a question. We just polled the American public, and we asked them this question: what percentage, and I want to see if you know how they answered. So what percentage of voters do you think agreed with the following statement? We asked them: assistance to other countries with weaker health systems are investments that make Americans safer and help them fight diseases. So do you think voters agreed with this? Do you think 15% voters agreed with that statement? 35% voters agreed with that statement? 60% voters, or 80%, agreed with the statement that assistance to other countries with weaker health systems are investments that make Americans safer, help them fight diseases. So you can go ahead and vote. There's a little poll button down at the bottom. Please vote. Take a minute. All right. Emily, can you show us how people voted? All right, so your Seattle constituents think that Americans only believe that 35%. Well, the actual answer is this. Can you show us, my team, how Americans actually believe? So this is pretty stunning, Congressman. I want you to answer this. Right now, Americans actually get this. We just did a bipartisan poll, and 80% of Americans actually get that.
Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt your point, but you're asking the wrong question. Okay, to truly figure
Tell
out
us the right question we should
whether or
ask.
not the public is doing it. If you ask them, should we? Sure. The right question is, how much taxes are you willing to pay to make sure this happens? And this is a fundamental problem with the way we approach public policy in this country. Yeah, sure. People are fine with it. I mean, that's why,
Well, it's actually interesting. So maybe I could just ask you this.
Go ahead.
We actually asked them if they would spend money. I won't take everybody's time now because they want to hear you, not me. And we asked them if they would spend money. You can take this down, Sydney, from this. But we asked them if they would spend money, and they actually were willing to spend quite a bit of money on the poll. We're happy to give that to you. But my question is, what do you think we should be doing in terms of responding to the global? Should we be spending money? Do you think we should be spending money? This is going to come up in the next supplemental in terms of whether or not we should have some investments for state, for USAID, for programs like Gavi, for programs like the Global Fund. How important is it that we invest in these global platforms? Because we know that we could get everything right here, which we're not going to, but let's say we do. And if the disease is still overseas, it could rebound back here.
There are 2 points here. First of all, it is crucially important that we invest in this. And this is part of the speech I've been doing for like 20 years as to why it matters what goes on globally. And we always narrow it down to, I focus on 4 things. One is, first of all, I think it matters because the United States is the richest country in the world by a comfortable margin. And if we are to live our values and we can help people who need help, we ought to help them and we ought to live up to our values. But if we want to put that rather, naive, noble sort of way of looking at things aside and just get practical about it, we ought to do it because the global economy affects us profoundly. We are 5% of the population, 20% of I think like 23% of global consumption now. So growing markets overseas, our economy depends on it. Number 2 is because of instability in the form of terrorism or war could also hurt us badly, and it can pop up everywhere. Unstable, ungoverned places lead to things like 9/11. And number 3 was always what we're dealing with now. is global health. As Bill Gates said, viruses know no borders here. So, if you want to just look at it from our own selfish interests, those are incredibly compelling reasons to do it. The point I'm trying to make about where the American public is at can best be summarized by the fact that there's, if you do similar polls like that and about the budget, there's a clear majority in this country, probably in that 80% range, that says we should have a balanced budget. That is the way they feel. There was also similar support for the notion that we should raise no taxes whatsoever. And then also, and Pew Research does fascinating polling along the lines of what you just said, focusing on the spending side. Okay, you want a balanced budget, you don't want your taxes raised, so what do you want cut? And the answer is they don't want anything cut either. All right. The cognitive dissonance here cannot possibly be overstated. So it's not just enough to poll the people and say, do you support this? Would you be willing to pay for it? How does that fit into a fiscal picture? That's where we tend to run headlong into problems, and why we wound up with the Budget Control Act, countless government shutdowns over the course of the last decade, and even more continuing resolutions that did great harm to the discretionary budget in particular, and foreign assistance, the little pie chart you showed at the start there, foreign engagement more broadly. That's in the discretionary budget, and it's gotten its teeth kicked in the last decade because the American people have continued to insist that we balance the budget without raising taxes or cutting spending. So, and I have a long explanation for how our politics has led us to this level of cognitive dissonance and how crucially important it is that we change that so that we can actually address issues like this. But I will spare you that and just say those are the challenges, to get the American people to have a more realistic assessment of what we can do and to understand the importance of engaging with the rest of the world. Because obviously we just elected our last president based on the principle that we should disengage from the world.
Can I ask you a question wearing your armed services chairman committee hat? Because one of the concerns that I've heard a lot of people talking about is that the national security threats due to COVID-19. I saw a report that the U.S. military is warning that the spread of COVID-19 could lead to a rise in resurgence of ISIS in places like Syria. I saw another report about how the scarcity of food is going to lead to an increase, of course, of migration to people going into more conflict and fragile states. Of course, we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism in many places around the world. We could probably have a whole conversation just on this, but what worries you with your national security lens and hat on?
Well, two things worry me. One, they all flow from this fact. Obviously, this is an incredibly destabilizing event. So as I said earlier on when we were talking about how threats from terrorism and other types of conflict come from from a lack of engagement in the world. If you have states that are unable to govern themselves, like what happened in Afghanistan and Somalia and a bunch of other places, that leads to instability, and instability can absolutely lead to national security threats because that's when terrorists and psychopaths are able to fill the void. And this is an unbelievably destabilizing event. If countries were struggling before, they're going to be struggling even more now. They're going to be unable to provide for people, and they're going to be just ripe for extremist groups to come in and say, we have a better way. So that's number one. Number two is the possibility that this will consolidate an authoritarian approach to government. And by the way, China is being unbelievably aggressive right now on pitching that message. In fact, I have a rather amusing little video out if you want to watch it. That sort of, in a joking sort of way, compares the Chinese response to the pandemic to the U.S. response to the pandemic. And they're not completely wrong, by the way, although they do leave out some key details. But they're going to make the case that, see, our authoritarian control model protects you. Democracies, it doesn't protect people. And we saw it in, I think it was Hungary, sorry, I should know, where basically they're on the verge of ceasing to be a democracy. And, so those are the two things: unstable states that now present a terrorist threat, the rise of authoritarianism, and the history that we learned, right up through World War II is authoritarianism leads to more national security threats. I think those are the two biggest national security threats.
Let me try to get two more questions in before opening it to the audience. I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, and it was the word economy. Obviously, in addition to the health crisis, there is an economic crisis. 30 million unemployed as of right now, probably even more. IMF is predicting that the global economy is going to decline by at least 3%. And obviously, the number of jobs in Washington state that is connected to the international market is enormous, not to mention the number of global companies that are sitting in your backyard. One of the things that I have been watching is the emerging markets, which are so critical to our trade, were already stressed before COVID-19, and we know this is only going to get worse. G20 and the IMF announced suspension of debt relief already, but it is likely not to be enough. So can you talk about your concerns, what you think America should be doing? You've already begun talking about not enough, but what we should be doing to deal with the economic side of it, knowing that there's so much we need to be doing here domestically, but how that interconnection is so real.
Well, I think, and I'll go to the point that I think is most important here that might not readily occur to folks. Certainly our job to sort of, shore up stability in the most unstable and vulnerable populations globally just became a whole lot more difficult. That global effort, the Gates Foundation, a whole bunch of other groups are actively involved in this. We got a lot more work to do to try to deal with people in extreme poverty and to deal with starvation, deal with crisis. Also, incidentally, to deal with more healthcare outbreaks of other diseases. We've been fighting malaria and tuberculosis and AIDS and a lot of other diseases. That fight's going to get more difficult now as governments are less able to deal with it. But look, the second point, and one that I try to make that I don't think people focus enough on, is the concentration of wealth in the global economy is the greatest failing, to my mind, of the post-World War II order that we just talked about. And that failing really didn't start until like the 1970s. But what has happened with our global economic move, and the U.S. is as responsible for this as anybody, is when it comes to making money and work, in the last 50 years, we have seen a shift to pay executives, take care of shareholders, pay workers as little as you possibly can get away with it. That has become the economic model. And what that has resulted in is a massive concentrate, even before this pandemic, the fundamental unfairness of, I don't want to pick on any particular company, but in the area that I live in, okay, there is so much wealth. There are a ton of people who, from an economic standpoint, the pandemic is borderline irrelevant. Okay, they've got so much money, they got plenty of cushion, it's all good. Now we all can't go anywhere, and there's all kinds of things that impact everybody, and we're all vulnerable to catching the disease. But the economic divide in this country and in the globe now just had the world's biggest microscope shined on it. And we can make different choices. And I tell you, the biggest thing is we do not pay workers for the work they do. We figure out all kinds of creative ways to make sure our shareholders get all kinds of money and the top executives get all kinds of money, but if you're working in a warehouse, my father was a baggage handler at United Airlines, your pay has just, and this idea that, well, yeah, but we give them stock options. Okay, a stock option for someone making $40,000 a year is not the same as someone getting a $5 million bonus at the end of the year in excess stock. It doesn't really add up. If we don't start prioritizing paying workers and giving them benefits for the work they do, there will eventually be a global revolution.
Powerful, powerful. All right, I want to end with one last topic and bring in a real deep focus on the humanitarian part of the global crisis. I read a study this week from the International Rescue Committee. They took a look at 34 of their most conflicted the countries that had the most conflict-fragile states, and they are predicting at risk the number of people who could get contract COVID-19, 1 billion, and that relates to 3.2 million deaths. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. So right in your home area, there are amazing, inspirational NGOs that are on the front line of making a difference. And I'm going to invite one person from your community, because we couldn't invite everybody, but I wanted to invite one who is represents World Vision, who is an important partner. Here's Erica Van Daren to just give a little bit of a perspective of what many, many, many people are doing around the world to make a difference on the front line. So Erica, share just a 1-minute snippet of what's happening around the world, and then we'll come back to Congressman to ask a quick question. Erica.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks to the USGLC for having World Vision join today. And thanks also to Representative Adam Smith. I've been your constituent since you were in the Washington State Senate, and our World Vision headquarters are in the 9th Congressional District, so it's really good to be here today. World Vision is a large global humanitarian and development agency. We've been responding to COVID-19 since February through our office in China. And as the pandemic has grown, our response has also grown. On March 11th, just an hour after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, World Vision declared its largest humanitarian emergency response in our history, a $350 million response spanning 70 countries, aiming to reach 72 million vulnerable children and their families in the US and abroad. When it comes to COVID-19, we're all fragile, but we're not all equally fragile, as you guys have been discussing. And so we're really urging the world and us as Americans to unite to focus on the most vulnerable children, especially refugees and displaced children. Millions of children are displaced, living in urban poverty, conflict, in large overcrowded areas with limited access to healthcare where social distancing is completely impossible. And our worst nightmare is seeing this virus take hold in these conditions. And while we think about COVID-19 as primarily a health crisis, the secondary impacts that this is going to have on vulnerable children and their families are going to be swift and severe. We recently did a report that estimates that more than 30 million children are at risk of disease and death because of these secondary impacts, including rising insecurity, global hunger, deaths from preventable causes, where pressures put on already weak health systems. But I want to emphasize that amidst all of this, there are things that we can be doing to ease these secondary effects. And the US World Vision is working hand in hand with faith leaders, school districts, the private sector across the country to provide emergency kits to families, including some in the Seattle and Tacoma area, reaching 23,000 people already. And globally, World Vision has already reached more than 22 million people in our response. And the US government, the private sector, generous American donors, they have been really critical partners for World Vision in past humanitarian crises, and we will continue to really rely on them. So thank you very much for the USGLC and Congresswoman Smith.
Thank you.
So, Erica, thank you. Thank you. So Congressman, I know you know World Vision, you know so many of the international NGOs, and I wonder if you could just kind of comment on the importance of these public-private partnerships and the role that our civilian side and our citizens play in doing good around the world, and how important, you know, the participants that are part of this town hall that we don't get to see and you don't get to talk to, but what role they play in making a difference in the world, and what you would say to them about what they can be doing right now during the midst of this crisis.
Well, I think the biggest positive in global development and foreign aid and international development has been the private sector in the last several decades. The NGOs that have risen up, World Vision is one of the long-standing ones that's been there for a long time, but a whole lot of other organizations have gotten involved, and the amount of money available to all of them has grown incredibly. And the approach that they've brought to going after all manner of different development issues, certainly global health, but food supply, education, governance, you name it, the skill set that was brought and the approach, I think really has helped the global effort to confront development issues across the board. So it's crucially important. Now, the thing that I think we still need to work on and get better is how to coordinate those efforts. I do think that the NGOs and private sectors have done a great job. In our own state, we have Global Washington, which is a brilliant idea. I forget how long they've been around. It's been a while. Sometimes I forget how long I've been around, so it's hard to keep track of all that. But what they did is they said, okay, we've got all these NGOs in the state of what, let's bring them together and let's on a regular basis talk about what we're working on. So you can coordinate those resources, large and small, everything from the Gates Foundation and World Vision to a local Kiwanis club that's adopted a village in El Salvador that they're working with. How can we better coordinate and develop best practices? Now, how do you take that and coordinate it with the government response, whether, USAID, the different organizations that we have that do international work, how do they work together, or, other nations, the DFID, Department for International Development with Great Britain, and how do you coordinate those resources so you can maximize that effort? There's still work to be done. I worked with Congressman Ted Yoho this past year to pass legislation to improve the Foreign Development Investment Corporation, so that it could take an equity stake in some of the investments, so it could then partner with other organizations that are making investments. And it's all a matter of maximizing your resources and coordinating them effectively. And that is a leadership role that I think the U.S. could and should take.
That was a really important piece of legislation. All right, we're going to open it up to questions. Again, if you go into the Q&A section, you can write your answer there, your question there. You can also, quote, raise your hand in the participant, and we will get as many in as possible. State your name, no speeches, just real quick questions. And I'm going to start with General Jimmy Collins. You have unmuted yourself, and please ask your question.
Thank you very much, Liz. Congressman Smith, good day, and thank you for your continued steady leadership in the Congress and on the world stage. As a retired Army veteran, I've seen both our defense and civilian tools of engagement and action firsthand, both having lived and also worked in Europe, Asia Pacific, and South America. I've seen the important roles that each of these play as a part of a comprehensive national strategy. From your experience as Armed Services Committee Chair, can you speak to why a whole of government approach is so critical to combat the complex threats we face today, such as pandemics? And as a follow-up in advance, what would be the consequences if we shortchange these civilian tools and over-rely on the Department of Defense?
No, I think that's a crucial
All right,
question.
great. Before you question, why don't we take one more, because there's so many. I want to get as many in as possible. Is that okay?
Adds a degree of difficulty, but I'll work through it. Go ahead.
I know how smart you are. I just heard you. Larry Brown. Okay, that's a great question. Larry Brown? Larry? Is it? I think you're there. We just need to unmute you.
Go ahead, Larry. You're all unmuted.
Thank you much. Thank you, Congressman. As you know, my name is Larry Brown. I'm president of the State Labor Council. I first want to thank you for your comments on the global income and wealth inequality. Solving that's going to solve a lot of problems. But I also want to ask you about, as Liz said earlier, and I've heard you say in the past, Washington State's economy is the most trade dependent in America, producing over 20% of our jobs. In the midst of this pandemic-caused economic crisis, we're worried not only about America's workers, but also about people living in emerging economies who have and will be especially hard hit. Washingtonians understand that investments in international development and diplomacy are helping to open and grow the economies to the benefit of Washington workers and the companies where they work. Can you talk for a minute about the importance of investing in the global response to COVID-19 and how that affects the sustainability and prosperity of the Washington worker?
Ooh, okay. I'll stop there. I won't make you do more than two.
That's okay. So taking General Collins' comment first, the whole of government approach is enormously important. And the easiest way to think about it is you got a ton of jobs and a ton of tasks. And this isn't necessarily the area that I would have chosen to learn these lessons, but in Iraq and Afghanistan, we learned a lot of these lessons. And you need security, but after security, you need governance, you need rule of law, you need education, you need transportation, you need infrastructure. All of these pieces come together in helping a country that's underdeveloped get developed. And everyone's got a different set of expertise. Now, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was, DOD was there, so they wound up doing a whole lot of things that were outside of their normal area of expertise. I remember this when I met General Pete Corelli when he was in charge of he was in charge of Baghdad, basically, the first Cav. And, he was basically a city planner. I mean, he was trying to figure out electricity and all this other stuff. Well, there's other people who know that better. So how do we fold them in and get them involved? And one of the big problems there is DOD is where the money is. You can tell all these other people to go there, but DOD's got, $740 billion, and they typically can find 10 million or whatever if they need it for some emergency, or it tends to become more of their response. And I could say a lot about this, but I'll just tell you one quick story from when I was in Kenya a while back, and they were talking about some development projects there. And I was actually out to dinner with a couple of Navy SEALs and also a State Department person. And they were talking about that conflict between DOD and, State Department or other agencies taking responsibility. And there had been an instance in Kenya where there had been a water shortage in some part of it, and then needed to drill wells. So DOD just sort of took it on themselves, sent some bunch of their guys up there and dug a bunch of wells without really consulting with the State Department. At which point the local villagers, seeing the U.S. military there, thought they were poisoning them and turned into a huge problem. Let's just put it that way. That is why you need a balance and a whole of government approach, and why we cannot gut the State Department and say that we have any sort of global international strategy. That's the whole of government thing. And absolutely, Larry, I think the U.S. can take a leadership role on this, but we have to overcome the current administration's approach to foreign policy, because understand that the current administration's approach to foreign policy has three central tenets, if they're not ever actually expressed. Number one is a hostility to global alliances. That's why we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. It's why we pulled out of the Paris Accords. It's why we're pulling out of every treaty we've signed with Russia that we possibly can. It's why there were musings about why are we in NATO. It's why they're shaking down South Korea right now for more money, jeopardizing that relationship. It is truly an America first approach, and it is incredibly dangerous. Second is the notion that the U.S. has basically been played for a sucker by the rest of the world. And I've heard the president say this directly in meetings that I've been present in, that, why are we doing all this for all these other countries in the world? They don't do anything for us, which is a spectacular lack of understanding of how the U.S. benefits from a stable global picture in ways that I described earlier, because we are such a prosperous nation. If there is a collapse, we have more to lose than others. We are not doing it out of the goodness of our heart entirely. We are doing it because it is in our benefit. And lastly is that the president has an affinity for autocrats, which plays out in a number of negative ways. So we can change that and re-engage. And I also really want to emphasize the importance of workers in this. And you can bring it all the way down to the meat plants that are shutting down now. And, having noticed that this is a problem in the food supply, it's great that the president said, okay, these things have to be open, but they're not going to be open if workers are afraid of going in there. Well, how do you prevent that? You work with the workers about how can we make this safe? You get them the masks, you get them the testing, you get them what they need. These are fights that I know, Larry, you and many others have fought on basic worker safety provisions. That, there are a lot of companies that do a great job on that, and I applaud them. They work very carefully with their workforce. They understand the importance of their workforce, and they get it done. There are others who simply blow right past it and build bad relationships with their workforce. That just makes it tougher to get done everything that we need to get done.
Great, thank you. Let's try to get two more in, see how many we can get in. Megan Pratt, you are next. Megan.
Hi there, I am the Director of Engagement for the Faith to Action Initiative, and actually formerly with World Vision. Thanks so much to each of you for connecting with us today. My former colleague, Erica, actually mentioned the potential for the growing number of impoverished people and the potential for a growing number of people who are hungry as well. How do you see this pandemic affecting the gains that we have made in the developing world?
That's
Well,
a great
first of all, I
question.
think it's really Oh, I'm sorry. Go
Can we
ahead.
take one more? Let's take one more. No, that's okay. Ambassador Roger Meese. I see your name on the list.
Thank you
You
very
raised your
much.
hand, I saw. There you
Yes.
are. Okay, great.
Thank you to the USGLC, and thank you, Congressman, for this opportunity today and for your continued strong support. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council here. And I take note that May 1st traditionally has been Foreign Service Day. In that regard, I'm concerned about the damage that has been done to the institution of the Foreign Service. The loss of a lot of senior people, the general weakening of the systems. And I fear that will be a problem even for the implementation of the policies such as you are advocating for a strong re-engagement and a whole of government approach to many problems. I'd be appreciative of hearing your thoughts about this, the impact, how difficult will it be, and what we can all do to support such efforts.
Certainly. Well, on the first point, and I think the really important thing, Erica, as part of it, is I think people did not fully understand the gains that had been made. And the work that the World Vision, many of the people on this call and many others have been doing over the decades has made a real difference. I mean, the decline in extreme global poverty has been significant. A lot of progress has been made because of the work that has been done. And you're right, a lot of that progress is in jeopardy because of the pandemic. Now, if we hadn't made that progress, it'd be even worse. So we shouldn't underestimate what was accomplished. But we have to have a comprehensive approach. And we've talked about a lot of the whole of government stuff. The big thing I want to emphasize, and I think it was Austin Goolsbee who said that the first rule of pandemic economics is nothing matters more than getting the virus under control, a point that I haven't made yet. But you know, certainly there's a lot of other issues to do. But until we get a vaccine, until we get the testing, tracing, isolation regime in place to control the spread, it's going to have a devastating impact. There's nothing to stop that. So making the investments in global health that are necessary now, and yes, Bill Gates is right, it would have been better if we had done this in advance and we'd been prepared for it, but you know, we are where we are. So making the investment now is better than not doing it. So, and we all know it's not at the end of the day that complicated how you try to contain and control a virus. It's enormously difficult. But it's not like we have to come up with some brand new system. The idea of how you contain a virus is well known by public health officials and epidemiologists the world over. I think if we're going to, step number one is to get it under control. Because as long as it's spreading rampant through communities, it's going to be very, very difficult. Yeah, the Foreign Service thing sort of, you know, I 100% agree with you. I try not to be overly partisan in my conversations, so that question makes it difficult. But the gutting of the State Department under this administration is a real problem. And a number of things have sort of been central to that. Right up the bat, Rex Tillerson was really bad at his job, from what everybody tells me, which kind of surprised me, to be honest with you. I sort of figured he could at least run an organization, but the morale at the State Department was never worse than when he was in charge of it. I'm not the biggest Mike Pompeo fan in the world, but from an organizational standpoint, he's a little bit better in that regard, and that helps. But then everything that happened in Ukraine and all of that continues to undermine the confidence in our diplomacy. And there are two aspects of the way the president does his job that are particularly problematic. As I've traveled internationally and met with State Department people and others who agree internationally, one of the biggest problems they have is when they're working with governments and foreign entities, the foreign governments and foreign entities look at the ambassador or whoever it is they're talking to and say, basically, why am I talking to you? All right. Because we know you have no authority. You tell me this, I get out of bed tomorrow morning and there's a tweet that totally reverses it. It's obvious that there's no effort whatsoever to empower local diplomatic leaders to have any say. It just sort of flits all over the place. And that really guts their credibility. And then the second thing is the president's, how can I put this exactly? Well, narcissism is the central problem, but the point of it is that if you're now working in the State Department, you're working anywhere in government, In fact, I'm in trouble right now with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff over something I said yesterday along these lines. When the most important aspect of your job in the federal government is making sure that you suck up to the president, that undermines your ability to be competent, to say what is true. And I'm not saying you run around the world talking about how much you hate your boss. You don't do that. But now you are backed into a corner where you can't tell the truth. You can't do anything. Everyone is being second guessed over, what if this makes the president look bad? And then we wind up fired. And you wind up putting people into office whose primary qualification is to be a sycophant. It's not that they might not also be competent. That could happen. I think, I look at Dr. Birx as the best example of what I'm talking about. She is brilliant. I think she's doing a great job. But when you look at her interviews, you can tell that she knows the number one most important thing that she has to do in the first minute that she's on any air is say something about how great the president is. And if she doesn't do that, she may not keep her job. I will tell you that's not the end of the world. It undermines competence. It undermines the ability to look at data in an intelligent way. And I think those two things have really contributed to a decline in morale at the State Department and a decline in its credibility globally.
Let's try to take one last question that I'm going to pull now from the written ones, and then I'm going to ask a closing question, and we'll make sure we end on time. But one of our guests, Zan Gustafson, wanted to know about this idea that I've heard from actually many people, that when we finally get this under control, is it time for, and we hear this term all the time, but a Marshall Plan for the 21st century. But the part of her question that I actually, certainly feel free to pick up on that, but we haven't talked about is how this fits into climate change, because we know that COVID-19 is already having an effect on climate. There's been reports that it's actually improved a little when we all get into our homes and aren't driving our cars and running our businesses. But could comment on, is this a moment where we can say we really have to invest in the world in a big way? And is it a moment where we can also remind our fellow citizens time to step up on climate? Congressman.
The Marshall Plan.
You've been saying this a long time.
Yeah, I mean, the Marshall Plan is kind of the wrong analogy for a reason I'll get into in a second. But yes, essentially. The difference is the Marshall Plan reflected the fact World War II was over. We were the last person standing. So the U.S. did it. We did the Marshall Plan. What I think is we need a global Marshall Plan. It's not just the U.S. contributing to this. And by the way, for all of our conflicts with China, the world would be a better place if we got along with them. Russia as well. I mean, if you can envision a world where the great powers of the world, just like we came together after World War II, come together now, and if you can bring in, Russia, China, the European Union, India, certainly, Japan, Brazil, once they impeach the nut job of a president that they have right now and get back to normal, that the large growing powers in the world, bring them all together. And that's kind of what the Paris Accords were meant to be as a starting point. We need a global Marshall Plan, I think, on climate change and on poverty and development. Absolutely. So
this is a very hard topic that we're talking about in the midst of COVID-19. And I want to end on an optimistic note. So which I've heard you speak on as well. And a lot of things you're saying are kind of looking over the crisis. And one of the things that I have noticed, as I know you have noticed, is that during these last 7 weeks, there is such inspiration of watching the frontline workers as well as watching amazing, we just heard from World Vision, but amazing inspiration of organizations, of businesses, of foundations, of individuals around the world. So can you share with us what your vision is, what your hope is, that when we get over the pandemic, when the vaccine is found, when treatment is found, what is your hope? What is the positive vision that you see coming out of all of this?
Well, fundamentally, I'm an optimist. And one of the things that makes me optimistic about our current situation is I always have this way of looking at problems And that when you have a problem and a challenge, well, I always like to use the line from The Princess Bride, what are my assets? What are my liabilities? Now, in any given situation, you're going to have some of both. And some situations are worse than others. But what makes me really optimistic about our ability to confront problems in this nation and globally is we have an enormous number of assets at this point. I've been in situations in my life when I was younger, in particular, when it's like I had big ambitions, things I wanted to do, and I looked at my assets, and I was like the guy in The Princess Bride outside the gate facing an army, and all he had was a cloak. It was like, well, hell, this could be better. And there's ways to find your way around problems like that, even. But now, as a globe, we have never had the amount of assets that we have to confront problems and challenges. And
really
I mean, just in the state of Washington, I saw there was some chat stream about if the state of Washington can could access some of its local and global. Well, we have. I mean, we're working with Microsoft, we're working with Amazon, we're working with the Gates Foundation, we're working with all these assets that are right here. And if we identify a problem and we say, you know what, we are going to throw everything we've got at solving that problem. If we make that decision, we have almost limitless assets in terms of wealth and technology and education and talent. It is all right there. If we make the decision, we're going to confront this problem. We're going to bring everyone together. We're going to use all those assets to solve it, whether it's coming back from this pandemic, dealing with climate change, figuring out the worker issues that we talked about earlier. We've got this ability. It's just that we're a little bit slow to it, which always in my optimistic note, I always like to take the quote from Winston Churchill about America, that you can always count on America to do the right thing once they've exhausted all the other options. Okay, so I'd like to think at this point we've exhausted all the other options. So now let's bring ourselves together, use all of those assets that we have, both domestically and globally, and let's go after these problems. We know what they are. Let's use the resources we have to go get it done.
So we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to introduce, to close us out, my colleague Luke Wentz, but I want to personally thank. You can't get a standing ovation on Zoom, but if we could, I am 100% certain, Congressman, you would, because when it comes to America's role in the world and standing up for what is right, standing up for the people of your district and the people of the United States, you look it up in Webster. It says Representative Adam Smith. You are extraordinary, and we're so lucky to have you.
Just building off one of my early themes, I'm not actually the president. I don't require that or need that, but I appreciate the sentiment, and more importantly, I appreciate the fact that you're all there to work together, so that I can work with you to help confront these challenges. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all you do. So, ladies and gentlemen, don't hang up yet. We got 2 more minutes, and I want to introduce to thank Congressman Smith and to tell you the next steps, because we do need your help a little bit. And that's my colleague who actually put all this together, and it is our Regional Western Director, Luke Wentz, my colleague, to close out our virtual town hall with Congressman Adam Smith. Luke. Wait, we can't hear you yet. Wait, get off of mute. There you go.
Thank you, Liz.
Have to make sure the mic works.
Right. Thank you so much for your willingness to join us for this conversation. It's always good to see you. I've seen you in Seattle a number of times over the last few years, so it's been great to see you virtually here as well. Thank you so much for your unwavering support of America's global leadership, especially during these critical and pivotal times in American history. And for all of you who are willing to join us for this important call, thank you so much for joining us, and thanking Congressman Smith for his work, including our outstanding Washington Advisory Committee and all of our veterans for smart power throughout the state of Washington as well. And just so you all know, USGLC is sending out regular updates to let you know kind of what's happening in Washington and around the world. If you're not receiving those updates, please reach out to me after this call, and we'll make sure you continue to receive those updates. And then, of course, follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, to make sure that you're getting the most up-to-date updates there as well. And look, right now, the most important thing we can be doing is thank your congressmen for all the work that they're doing to create the conditions for this better and safer world. And what we're trying to do is protect our economic security, our national security, and really maintain the values proposition of the United States. So just keep talking about why this matters at home for you and your family and for your community. And thank you again, and wishing you all the best during these difficult times. My favorite part of my job is getting the chance to speak with all of you. So please don't hesitate to keep reaching out, and stay safe. Have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Congressman.
Bye. Have a great day. Thank you, Congressman. We'll clap for you.
I appreciate it.
Have a
Thank you.
good day, everybody.
We'll stay in touch. Thanks for your work.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Stay safe.